Erev Tov, Bruchim Abayim. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. It's not often in the past I remember that we started quite so early in the season, but we reckon that with a long September before Rosh Hashanah, it would be a pity to waste an opportunity and also to shorten the long break of the summer. So here we are with our first meeting of the new session, and we are again delighted as ever to hear a lecture by Rabbi Raymond Apple, who will pose the question, Chief Rabbi Herman Adler, a willing captive of the gilded gentry? Now, Raymond Apple hardly needs an introduction to this audience, I imagine. He was born and educated in Melbourne. He went on to study at Jewish College London, where he was awarded his ministerial and rabbinical diplomas. After serving as minister of the Bayswater and Hampstead synagogues, he returned to Australia and became senior rabbi of the Great Synagogue in Sydney, a position that he occupied for 32 years. During that time, he held office inter alia as senior Jewish chaplain to the Australian Defence Force, president of the Australian Jewish Historical Society, and president of the Australian Council of Christians and Jews. He was, for many years, regarded as Australia's highest profile rabbi, and he was created, among other honours, Officer of the Order of Australia. Since his retirement in Aliyah, he has devoted himself to religious and historical research, gaining a wide audience through his Oz Torah publication and his frequent articles in the Jerusalem Post. An active member of our committee, Rabbi Apple has given us half a dozen lectures on Anglo-Jewish topics, and he and his wife Marion have 2 sons and 2 daughters, as well as a number of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I now have much pleasure in inviting Rabbi Apple to deliver his address.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, when I think back to the years that I spent in Britain, I realise that in those days I was an English gentleman. I would never ever appear in public without a tie, and actually on Shabbat, as I mentioned to Sharon about 20 minutes ago, on Shabbat I wore striped trousers, black jacket, and a bowler hat, apart of course from the fact that in synagogue services I knew how to be properly dressed. When I came to Hampstead, I was actually informed that I had to wear a clerical collar, and the story of what happened to my clerical collar before I left London is another story altogether with which I might entertain you on some future occasion.
Was it a burning occasion?
Not quite, but still. The name of Herman Adler is probably very little known amongst Anglo-Jews wherever they live in this generation. But there was a time at which it was regarded as unthinkable for Britain to have a chief rabbi with any other name than Adler. Nathan Marcus Adler held the office of chief rabbi for a period of 45 years. He was succeeded by his son Herman, who was acting chief rabbi for about the last 11 years of his father's life, and then assumed the position of chief rabbi in his own right for 20 years. There was a son, the Reverend Solomon Alfred Adler, who was fully expected to maintain the family tradition, except that unfortunately he died in his father's lifetime, which meant that the generations of the Adler chief rabbis came to an end. And while I offer no criticism of the subsequent chief rabbis, beginning with Hertz, none of them bore the name Adler. So today it's a name which is not within living memory, but nonetheless the Adler chief rabbis were fascinating characters, and Herman, about whom I'm going to speak tonight, was in many ways more fascinating even than his father, even though the father was a much greater scholar. There are two possibilities which face me at this moment. One is to read a prepared lecture. The other is just to talk off the cuff about Herman Adler. And what I propose to do, so that neither will you fall asleep, nor will I feel that I wasted all the time that went into preparing the lecture, I'm going to offer you a combination. So I'm going to read the paper I've prepared, but here and there I might digress and introduce an anecdote or two, just to make sure that some of the lighter human touches are included. The Times once told its readers that Herman Adler was a hereditary high priest. It is true that the family were Kohanim, descended from the biblical priesthood, but rabbis are not priests in the Christian sense, nor are chief rabbis high priests. Yet 19th century Anglo-Jewry had no doubt that Herman Adler would inherit his father's office. He had already fulfilled its functions whilst waiting in the wings. His own son Alfred might have carried the role into a third generation, but died as a young man. There was an analogy with the royal family, in which Queen Victoria held the throne for many years, whilst her son aged as Prince of Wales. And of course, one could make a comment about the present-day royal family, but here all I'm going to tell you is that I'm one of the few members of the rabbinate who has ever had the opportunity of a personal conversation with the present Queen. There was one occasion when the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh were on a royal visit to Australia, and there was an official state reception at the Wentworth Hotel in Sydney. The Duke went around the room in one direction, the Queen in another direction. The Premier of the state of New South Wales accompanied the Queen. When they came up to where I was standing, he said, "Your Majesty, may I present Rabbi Apple of the Great Synagogue?" At which Her Majesty, being a true professional, said to me, "The Great Synagogue, is that in Sydney?" And I felt like saying, "Yes, madam, and if you speak nicely to me, I'll find you a nice lady's seat upstairs in the gallery." But unfortunately, it was one of these occasions when I decided to bite my tongue and not be chutzpahdik. But I do tell people that for 3 weeks afterwards, I didn't wash my hands, having shaken hands with the Queen. I wouldn't admit this in all areas of Jewish company, because some would feel that it's not appropriate for a gentleman to shake hands with a lady, even if the gentleman is a rabbi and the lady is the Queen of the British Empire. Anyhow, born in Hanover in 1839, Herman was the son of Chief Rabbi Nathan Marcus Adler and his wife Henrietta. Arriving in London aged 6, Herman Adler recalled his childish wonder at his father's installation ceremony. He was educated at University College School and studied Talmud with his father. Ordained in Prague and with a doctorate from Leipzig, he started off by teaching at Jews College, gave lessons to the sons of the gentry, and was his father's secretary. When the Bayswater Synagogue was founded in 1863, Dr. Herman, as he was always known, Dr. Herman became its lecturer. He was there for 27 years. His colleagues, Isaac Samuel and Raphael Harris, were widely loved, but it was Dr. Herman around whom legends were built. His sermons, which often initiated new movements and institutions, were later published. He regularly addressed topics, quote, which moved our hearts both as Englishmen and as Jews. And I'd like you to bear in mind this phrase, both as Englishmen and Jews, because it will become relevant as we come towards the end of this particular paper, when we'll ask the question, to what extent was Herman Adler more English than Jewish? But for that you have to stay awake and wait a little bit. He called the modern preacher the lineal successor of the greatest of all preachers, the prophets of old. Cyrus Adler of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, no relation, called the chief rabbi a very sensible, plain-speaking preacher. A Liverpool paper said, Dr. Adler has a slight Hebrew, this meant to be Germanic, accent in his voice, which, however, in preaching is scarcely perceptible. He is an eloquent and most finished speaker and commands a broad vocabulary of classical English. He possesses that peculiar chromatic richness of language which is often observable in deep students of Oriental literature. The first Adler was involved in many internal Jewish controversies. Herman was a polemicist defending Jews and Judaism in the general community. He stood his ground even when Christians and Jews were both against him. His controversies, especially with Goldwin Smith, addressed issues as disparate as Jews as patriots and irresponsible wealth. In 1868, he gave a series of sermons rebutting Christological interpretations of Scripture. A few Jews feared he would jeopardize Jewish integration. Most admired him. The sermons were published, and Christian criticism reached a flood. A writer in The Scattered Nation on 1st June 1869 said that I'm sorry, I'm just interrupting myself for a moment in order to leave out a sentence or so. A writer in The Scattered Nation thought the rabbi would have ignored the subject if missionaries had not been hitting their mark. Adler mixed with peers, politicians and prelates. Stories of his friendship with Cardinal Manning include the possibly apocryphal tale that when the cardinal said, Rabbi, when are you going to eat ham? Adler replied, at your wedding, Your Eminence. It is said that he wore bishop's gaiters. Cecil Roth said there was an inevitable tendency for him to interpret his position almost in Anglican terms. After Nathan Marcus Adler moved to Brighton, leaving Herman as delegate chief rabbi, they wrote to each other almost daily. The old man was physically frail, but his opinions were sharp, and he made tart comments, for example, about a person whom he calls Reish Shin. We deduce that Reish Shin is Lord Rothschild, the president of the United Synagogue. Nathan Marcus died in 1890. On his deathbed, he linked the hands of Lord Rothschild and Sir Samuel Montague in order to create peace. Herman, as expected, became chief rabbi. It was not an easy time. Immigration was dividing the East End and West End. Chaim Berman called Adler the willing captive of the gilded gentry. Adler told Ahad Ha'am that the Russians and Poles were inferior to the English and German Jews. Adler's problems ranged from socialists whose grievances he did not really understand, to immigrant rabbis who conducted stille chasnas, weddings without civil registration, which he feared would jeopardize the stability of the community. Though the newcomers attacked his kashrut, Adler sometimes preached in Yiddish and urged the immigrants to learn a trade. Reverend B. Shevtzik said that Adler had worked 16 hours a day, 15 of them to help the foreign Jews. Bernard Rachman, a graduate of the Breslau Seminary, called Adler a man of noble presence, erect and stately. His expressive countenance, encompassed by a brown full beard, revealed the inner goodness of his nature. His manner was kind and affable. I was thrilled, it almost seemed as if we were intimate friends. Adler had visited the Holy Land and supported Jewish colonization, but he called political Zionism an egregious blunder, fostering fantastic and visionary ideas. Herzl sarcastically called Adler a man from Germany who would undoubtedly like to think of himself as